So Shuraako has organized the breakout sessions around energy tech, governance, strategy, workforce, and finance. I would like to start by saying that, you know, technologies are falling in price, but the key remains access to affordable electricity and reliability of supply. On the governance issue, it's important to mention that there are no sort of one model that works everywhere in the world. It's a fallacy to travel the world and say, oh, you need to organize your sector like this and that. In reality, each country is different, and there are different variations that needs to be accommodated. On the strategy side, I think it's important to mention that in many African countries, the import bill for fossil fuels is a very large part of the national economy. I believe that in Zimbabwe, about a third of the import bill is fossil fuels. I believe in Kenya, the second largest export item is Kenya's export of tea, and all the income generated from tea is spent on importing fuels. So there's a strategic issue for many African countries in trying to move away from having these enormous import bills and move to something more sustainable. We are going to touch on workforce issues numerous times during this, I think it's 4 days. We have 4 days here. We're going to talk about the fact that, for instance, renewable energy is labor intensive. It's actually potentially a source of jobs and income and putting money into local communities. You'll find in the US, for instance, that the solar and wind industry employ a lot more people than traditional sources of power. However, we do have an issue in this part of the world that we don't want to have these jobs going to imported people. I mean, we need to develop the skills here, otherwise those jobs will actually go to people not from here, without mentioning other nationalities. We will come to a brief discussion on finance. At the end of the day, the unique thing about renewables is that you basically prepay. What you do is you have very low operating costs. So what you're doing is you're actually paying your fuels for the next 20 years. So you pay on the first day. Now, I will show you a slide later on which indicates that that means that the crucial factor is what are you going to pay for your capital. That's what's going to decide how expensive your cost of generation is going to be. Let's move on. This is a favorite World Bank slide that I tend to travel with everywhere in the world. It's a very encouraging picture. Let me just walk up so we can talk through it. CSP is concentrated solar power. I think you know what that is. That is, you focus, use the solar, you use mirror, you focus, you generate steam and so on. That is a large-scale application, could come into play at some point, but not in the near future. What this shows is the range of prices that we have seen in the international markets. You'll see that wind has been coming in below 5 US cents. These are cost of generation, by the way. Levelized cost of electricity by plant type. You'll see that solar PV comes in here. You'll see that the competition in many countries is coal, combined cycle gas turbines, and fuel oil. And diesel is probably above here. You all know that in the sector. This is just to say that done correctly, renewables are competitive today as we speak, and it is possible to implement these kind of plants and get much lower cost. However, there's a lot of tricky details that you need to get right, and we're going to talk about what it requires the next couple of days. Can I have the next slide? That's one of those slides that have a problem. Let me just have some water here. Now, one thing about renewables is that your fuel source is the sun, or if it's geothermal, it's heat from the ground, or if it's wind, well, wind is actually also a function of the sun, but never mind, in an indirect way. So it's important, in general, it's important to know what sources of what your resource is. Obviously, if you don't know how much sun you have, or what the wind is like, it's going to be very difficult to use these technologies. That's all obvious. What I wanted to tell you is two things. First of all, that the bank are helping the whole region, covering Eritrea, Djibouti, this part of the world, Ethiopia and so on, doing a very large wind model. The cutout that you see there, you can probably guess, you can see the cutout. We have Djibouti up in the corner, and then Ethiopia and where we are today. The dark red colors are simulated wind speeds at 100 meters height, simulated hub height of 100 meters, and the dark red areas are outstandingly good. So the region's resources are very, very good. What we are going to do is, are you all familiar with IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency? So what happens is that IRENA puts out a lot of maps. These maps are actually based on the mapping that we are doing. So the representation that you see, in a couple of weeks' time, you'll be able to go to IRENA's website. You can Google IRENA Global Atlas. There's also a Global Atlas app on your phone. I'm not sure if it works on Android, but at least on iPhone, you can just download an app from the app shop, and you're able to get these maps, and they will cover this region as well. We already have Tanzania on the internet, on the phone. I can show you the wind resources in Tanzania on my phone. You can check it yourself. We will cover this part of the region in a couple of weeks' time. Now, there's a little thing at the bottom there saying, forget measurements. What do I mean by that? What I'm trying to say is that all these measurements are important for what we call large-scale, grid-tied investments. If you are doing a hospital here, a water pumping system there, you don't really need to focus so much on doing all these measurements. This is an investment in the future for you. When you want to do larger systems, then it becomes critical to know what the resource is. For smaller applications, I mean, let's look outside. I mean, the sun always shines. Just go ahead, do it. All right. Critical discussion points on the energy tech side. We have to take a step back and realize that consumers really don't care about the source. They need access to affordable and reliable electricity. And there's a question down there: does the consumer even need a traditional grid-based connection? There will be, and now I'm going to start making some references to the breakout sessions. There's a breakout session on very, very small systems, on DC, small-scale rural DC networks. There are people arguing now that for certain applications, we don't need the traditional grid model. There's a lot of discussion about retrofitting. Retrofitting means adding renewable sources to existing machinery. There are different schools of thought, and it's important to say, you know, I have my own views, other people in this room will have other views. We are finding that in many countries, it's turning out to be very difficult just to add a wind turbine or add a solar panel. We work a lot with Sorry, I don't know why I'm going so dry today. Talking too much. So we work a lot with the Alaska Energy Research Center. About a third of all installed mini-grids in the world, diesel mini-grids, are in Alaska. And they're in a process now of turning all these grids basically renewable. And what they found is that very often it's necessary to scrap what they have and redo the whole thing, because the existing diesel just doesn't really work with the solar or the wind that they're putting in. The control systems that the existing diesel has is not suitable when it becomes a hybrid system. So there are some dangers there. There are some lessons learned about whether you want to just buy solar PV and add it to it, or whether it's a more holistic approach where you actually look at making your diesel smaller, or instead of having a medium speed diesel or a low speed diesel, you have a quicker responding diesel, etc., etc. It's food for thought. I'm not saying that I'm right, but I think it's an important thing for the sector to think about whether retrofitting always works, or whether you want to sort of do a wholesale change when you are thinking to go renewable. There is something called right sizing, balance loads, and use loads to balance. You'll find that in a lot of countries, going back to, for instance, Alaska, there are places in Alaska where they run on wind for weeks on end without turning their diesel on. There is an island called Kodiak Island where they run sometimes for 5, 6, 7 weeks on wind only. How do they do this? They do it by having balance loads. So they have dump loads, they have freezer houses that they can turn on and off. When the wind turbines are producing more power than needed in the city, they pump all the electricity into cold storage and balance the load that way. They also have, well, that's enough as an example. The last point I wanted to make is forget renewable energy until you have the fundamentals sorted. And what I mean by that is that the greenest solution right now, where we are, is fixing your technical losses. That is greener than investing in turbines or solar PV. You will find that, 40% losses, if that's the correct average, that also means 40% of your diesel is burned unnecessary. Now, the other point to make is, of course, when you are retrofitting, whether we're just adding or we're doing a more wholesale switch of technologies, you want to scope out your renewable systems after you have addressed your technical losses. So you don't actually want to scope out the size of your solar PV for your existing load. You want to scope out for what it's going to be like when you have your technical losses under control. These are, in my opinion, key takeaways from the rest of the world, and I think it's something that we probably are going to discuss in some of the breakout sessions, and it's something that I personally always stress, but I'm open to other views. It's not like I have all the answers. Let's move on to the next slide. I think I made the point that governance is a unique local issue. I think there are some things that are important to mention in terms of governance, and maybe not what you were thinking about, but there are people in this region, IDPs, nomadic populations, and so on, who are not going to be covered by traditional energy solutions. Governance of the sector also means looking after people who are outside Hagese who will not be supplied through regular means. I think that's a very important point. It's an important point to the ministry that they have a total responsibility for everybody, not just the ones who can be reached by the grid. That means that governments have to cover more issues than just regulation or structuring of the electricity sector. There is a point down there on data drives decisions. And this is actually a quote that I got from Lee the other day. We had a discussion about this. The point being, and I'm going to come back to it also, but if the Honourable Minister wants to have an idea of how is he going to help IDPs or nomadic populations, as an example, he needs to know how many people there are, what their existing energy consumption is, how they are organizing their life today. So we will come back to this point also in relation to financing, that everybody, the sector, the association, the ministry, the people who are trying to help you, we need to have access and we need to know what the basic data are for the sectors. Let me have the next slide. I think this point has actually been made, so I'll make that very brief, but workforce development is coming up as the key sector. There's no doubt that we need to talk very seriously, and I think that's also the feedback that you've given in many of these surveys, that we're not going to make it without a serious change in developing the quality of our workforce. And it ranges from being able to handle some of these new technologies to issues such as health and safety standards, which, as we all know, and I've been privileged to visit many of your plants, is a serious issue. It's also a serious motivational issue that, you know, if people are exposed to rather, how shall I put it, unsafe conditions, that's probably not going to motivate them very much in their job. Let me have the next slide. All right, here's the famous slide. This is another favorite World Bank slide, and I'll spend a few seconds explaining it. What this shows is basically that if your cost of capital is 0, meaning you have your complete investment, this is a simulated 50 megawatt solar, grid-tied solar PV installation. If your cost of capital is free, let's say somebody, a rich uncle, gives you all the money, you're getting in at levelized costs way below 10 US cents. If your cost of capital is 20%, your levelized cost of generation will shoot up close to 25 US cents. So the key, all other parameters are the same. The cost of maintenance, it's the same technology. O&M is exactly the same. You can see the original investment in deep blue is exactly the same. The only thing that changes is the cost of capital. We have a 4.5-fold increase in the exit price depending on the cost of capital. This is a key issue, very key issue. Next slide. All right, finance. As you know, there are plenty of different ways of financing and there will be many sessions on this. There are plenty of ways of financing new renewable plants. You know all these. Retained profits, which is basically that the money that you make are reinvested. Now, when you are reinvesting, your cost of capital is, of course, not 0, because you could have invested that money in something else that would have given you a return. So we're not down at the 0% of cost of capital, even if it's your own money. Public-private partnerships, we have several IFC colleagues here who are experts on that. Some of them will be hosting a session on that particular topic. Foreign direct investment, I don't think my namesake Anders has arrived yet. There's a group of Danish investors who are going to be here at some point. They're brutal people. Danes are not as nice as they're said to be. So just, but they have money, so, but they are going to be towards the other end of the scale if you want to engage with them. Do seek them out, talk to them. They're looking for investments. There's a thing called vendor financing. You will find that if you go to General Electric in North America, you will see that if you persuade them to sell you a gas turbine or a wind turbine or some of the other equipment that they're willing to supply, they can also provide the financing. Very often, they can come with the financing, either through the official American system, you know, the US Exim Bank, but they also have other sources of actually financing the investment. Are they cheap? Not necessarily, but it is a potential source of financing. Way at the bottom there, you have the likes of myself, multilateral and bilateral financial institutions. You're familiar with the IFC that can make equity investments. Swede Fund, there are institutions tied to each and every of the Scandinavian countries who can make equity investments. We have Norway here, we have Sweden, we have Denmark. Many other European countries have these quasi-public investment vehicles that provide capital at a lower level, at a lower rate than the pure market rate. But that's what I'm going to leave you with. Information and data drive decisions. None of these investments, even from the World Bank, are going to come about unless we have a fair idea of how you are doing. There's a big job, I think, for the ministry and for the association and for some of the utilities here to get used to the fact that when you are going into the business of trying to get external capital, there's a trade-off in terms of what you have to do in terms of letting other people see your books. Many things like shortly, hopefully, one day, there will be a possibility of the World Bank lending in this region. Right now, as you probably know, we cannot lend, we're just doing grants. What happens then is when we start doing larger energy projects, we have a way of sort of presenting things, goes to the World Bank's board. It has to outline how many consumers are there, what are they paying now, what are the sort of repayment rate, how many delinquent customers are there in the system. There's a whole sort of range of things that are just part of a lending package. I'm going to make the request to you that we, going forward, start working a little bit, helping each other, getting this data out. I was very encouraged when I heard that you have actually gone ahead, at least up here in the north, with having an association. I think a very important role of the association can be to start collecting some of that data so it becomes easier to engage with people who are willing or interested in working with you. I think that's the last slide. Yeah.